Hi, this is Steve Hoskinson. Welcome to the End of Trauma. Today we're going to talk about some interesting topics and a wide range of ideas that are coming out of science. Part of my job is to be able to interpret the latest science for you, make it interesting and make it applicable. Organic intelligence is really founded on this scientific basis, and my job is really to transmit and communicate that information so that it is practical and practicable for you. This is for clinicians for sure, because our trainings have both the opportunity for clinicians to study with us, psychologists and other therapists, and as well have a strong component of support for the individual. Most of us believe that we can't really help someone go further than we have ourselves, and the level of organization that is possible and the level of healing that is possible within our own biology is probably much more vast than we consider. So I hope in this podcast to give you some ideas that help you understand how your system works, and then how to begin to grow and feed your biology the nutritional information that it really needs. Today's broadcast, we're talking about the strange attractor of trauma, the negativity bias, and the age of disintegration. Organic intelligence as a uniquely positive and positive psychology, positive reinforcement program has also a perspective on how things went wrong. That is, how we got to where we are. And the strange attractor of trauma is actually part of it. The negativity bias is something that we have to take into consideration. Most theorists suggest that our attention is unduly and disproportionately attracted to what's wrong. This is what in organic intelligence we call the what's wrong attention. And that attention means that the information of dysregulation, the information of negative affect, the information of threat and survival cues are being reiterated and repeated in one's consciousness, really unconsciously and involuntarily and habitually. And so there's research that is showing people, for instance, faces that have a more negative tone versus a more neutral or more positive. And then brain responses are measured. And there are higher activity levels and higher levels of brain responding to the negative feeling picture. And from this, then the researchers are suggesting that the draw and the magnetic attraction to what's wrong is inborn. Researchers and theorists have an idea that maybe this is related to survival. And this is an interesting hypothesis that says, maybe it helps us to be jumpy. Maybe it helps us to be on the lookout for what's wrong, because then if there is an attack or if there is a threat, then I can be alerted to that threat and survive and make a better response. Organic intelligence doesn't really necessarily buy that hypothesis. The nature of survival and the understanding of survival instincts has been perhaps too influenced by our individualist age. I think most evolutionary theorists, in terms of understanding human evolution, would suggest that the evolutionary power of our attention and the direction of our instinct is not only for the self-preservation or the preservation of the individual, but that as a uniquely social species and a uniquely tribal species, our instincts are honed for connection, for social engagement, and that in terms of threat, our threat operations, our fight and flight and freeze, are certainly relevant on an individual basis, but also they have to be seen within the group context, within the tribal context. So to suggest that one's attention is most favorably drawn toward what's wrong, I think misses the essential survival motif, which is that we exist better and smarter and safer in a group. And this means that our group instinct, our social instinct, our interpersonal instinct, our bonding instinct is probably more relevant an influence in our biology even than the most extreme versions of our attention that would result in threat detection, like the what's wrong attention, the negativity bias. Instead, I would suggest that the prevalence of this negativity bias, or the prevalence of the what's wrong attention, is a conditioned or learned process. It's a learned process given that our current society is inundated. There is an epidemic, unheard of for our species, of disconnection and disintegration. And to understand this age of disintegration, we have only to look to the geologists. The geologists call this age now the age of the Anthropocene. The age of the Anthropocene. And the Anthropocene age simply reflects that human action is what is the greatest influence in our planetary existence. So rather than being, say, an ice age or the Pleistocene or, the Bronze Age, what is now in terms of geologic influence, the most important is the activity of Homo sapiens. Right? So global climate change is one of the classic examples of that. The entire global ecosystem is being influenced by the activity of human beings. And that human action is disorganizing. That is one sign that human existence is characterized en masse, as a whole, by a quality of disorganization. That disorganization fundamentally means disintegration. In the last podcast, in our initial podcast, I talked about the importance of integration and used the term differentiation as a way of describing the flexibility of systems for parts to operate either autonomously or collectively. So in a tribe, in a group, it's important and very favorable that we can operate independently, and then that we can come back and operate as a whole, as an entirety. So that differentiation is integration, that integration of abilities for autonomous and individual function, and then collective function and collective organized interactions. So, for instance, in a culture where hunting and gathering is still existing, that's about 5 groups of people on the planet at this point. A person, an individual, small group of people may go out and do some hunting individually. People will maybe individually sit, do childcare, do handcraft, handwork on textiles, nets, and so on. And then from that dispersion, people come back, and then we sit around the fire and we tell the story of the day. And in the telling of that story of the day, everybody is reintegrated into the experience that everybody else had. There is the dispersion, the separation, the autonomy, the individuality, and then the return, and then the sharing and the recollection. That's an example of differentiation where Autonomy is had and collection is had. And that movement back and forth is happening all the time as well in our individual biologies. So the heart rate and the respiration are closely linked, then they may separate, and then they may then get back together again. This is good differentiation. It gives us flexibility. We can operate in much more complex ways and respond in much more complex environments by doing something like this. But anthropologists point to a place where everything changed. And the place where everything changed for our species was where we ceased being primarily then this differentiated group of nomadic hunter-gatherers. So between about 10 and 15,000 years ago, we began to domesticate plants and animals. And this happened in several parts of the world, in the Fertile Crescent, in Africa, New Guinea, all of these different places, grains and various foods were cultivated and then stored. And this had a massive effect because we would then become sedentary, we became more stable, which our biology likes, right? The balance between stability and recovery is key. And we began to have larger and larger groups of people living together. And again, anthropologists point to this time as the origin of inequality, as the origin, in a way, of injustice. And this, because the appropriation of resources became linked to survival. If I have more stuff, if I have more grain, if I have more land, control, power, I have better survival. So no longer was it the survival of our tribe. It could become then more like the survival of the individual. And competition could be a function of this. And there is very interesting research that demonstrates that people who are coming from low food accumulating cultures have better differentiation, better emotional differentiation, for example. So and this was, in a way, these unintended consequences. It seemed like such a good idea. We would have reliable food sources. We would have stores of food. We'd never sort of have those long periods of waiting for, the cactus fruit to ripen, right? Or waiting for, spring to come again. It seemed like such a good idea, but it set up something completely different. Set us on a course that has ended us up in the current situation. And that current situation is this moment of disintegration. And again, this all dates back to this very simple process of the domestication of plants and animals. So in this age of competition or individual striving, individual achievement having selective advantage, this predisposed success for those who could gain power. Power then initially described in terms of size, in terms of this relationship of size, agility, cultural and interpersonal cleverness, manipulation, basically. And then with that comes the priming for what we think of as sympathetic arousal. And by sympathetic arousal, I'm now talking about the branch of the autonomic nervous system that is responsible for our fight responses, flight responses also. So if you think of, say, traumatic responses where people are being hypervigilant, where they can't settle down, they're always scanning for danger. That's an more extreme version, but we have a society and culture, really a global civilization, that has unheralded versions of reinforcement for domination, for power, for control. Right? This has been now selected for 15,000 years. So, in order to overcome this, we have really quite a task, because this is the current civilization. This is our current condition. We're in a Nemo moment. We've been in this aquarium. These effects are the effects of our unintentional, our accidental domestication of ourselves. We're in a Nemo moment where we're in the aquarium, but we know that we belong somehow in the ocean, back in wild nature where we belong. And so part of the result of systems that are constantly working in a semi-battle situation, right? That is their fight and flight systems are being constantly stimulated and reinforced, is that constant aggravation is stress. And it's stress because our systems don't do the normal, easy ups and downs, that relaxed awareness, this feeling of belonging. We've lost our home. We are a vast civilization of homeless individuals trying to find our way back to our tribe, and trying to find our way back to a nervous system, to an organismic organization that is more original. There are people who have speculated on this, and also with this speculation, I'm referring to, what is our home really like? If we are now homeless, what was our home really like? And again, we're going to be looking toward informed anthropologists to tell us a little bit about what our natural environment might be like. Just a word here. So I'm going to give you a lot of citations. I'll have lists for you. Much of this is research I've done over many years, and I'm going to make it available to you. So check on our site here, the End of Trauma site, and get a download on this document. And it'll give you research articles, and it'll also give you a list of what I'm about to speak to you about. Because a scholarly and well-known anthropologist by the name of Paul Shepard, in 1998 wrote a book called Coming Home to the Pleistocene. And one of the things that Shepard does in this is lists many attributes of our original cultural setting. And by ours, I'm talking about the human cultural setting as hunter-gatherers. This is not without dispute, but I think it forms a really interesting counterpoint to see just how far off we've come, just how far from our origins we have come. I'm going to read you a few of these, and these I've just made a list of these. I've taken them right from Shepard's book, including appropriate citation, of course. 71 of these I've listed, and here are some of them that I think are super interesting and relevant for us as we try to consider, how do we help our biology get back? How can we help our system resync into our nature a bit more and resync with itself? Here are some of the ideas from Shepard. This is what Shepard says is more original to us. He talks about rich textures in play space. We're going to talk about this because we're going to see how babies' brains grow, and the complexity and the enrichment of the environment is really key. Celebration of life stage passages, such as initiation, right, from adolescence to adulthood, for women with an entry into menses. Extended family, dense social structure. Extended family. If you think in the current age, if you think of extended family for most of us in the West, that's a family reunion, which is usually a sign that we should schedule therapy for the following week. Not so for our ancestors, we believe. Extended lactation, so nursing for extended periods. What seems extended to us is actually more normal. Handmade tools and other objects. Prestige that is based on demonstrated integrity. Not, for instance, being a Kardashian, or others who are, in media or politics or whatever, have power. Prestige based on demonstrated integrity. Can we get back to that? Participant politics versus authoritarian politics. Decentralized power. Intertribal tension reduction rights. So song duels, peace pipes, mock battles can happen. The notion of spirit in all of life, this sense of common connection, life to life. And by the way, that was enhanced also by another aspect from our Pleistocene ancestral heritage, which is that as hunter-gatherers, the scenes of, when we snared a rabbit, then the preparation of that rabbit for dinner, for instance, everybody would see that, which means that everybody was doing a dissection class or part of a dissection class. And we could see that the rabbit and the deer and the giraffe and the gopher, all of them have similar structures, similar organ systems, similar skeletal systems, muscular systems, and people understood very likely that, that's us too. We are like that too. Not this, humans, Homo sapiens, and then those we low animals, but there is fundamental similarity. So we understood something about our physiology, about our structure, about our internal workings, and how that is connected all to life about us. There was also regular dialogue on dream experience, the importance of this numinous, of the imaginal, the regular dialogue on dream experience. Attention to listening, attention to the environment, to the sound environment as voice, listening for that voice. Attention and kinship to the presence of ancestors. Right, the basis and the real holding of a group is often considered to be that of the ancestors. The attunement to daily cycle and seasonality, and immediate access to the wild, wilderness, and solitude. This is from Paul Shepard, and this is part of the download that you can get with us. Look for that on our End of Trauma page. And part of what I want to highlight about this is the importance of rhythmicity. In terms of music, it was participatory, not going to a concert, not watching a musician, but participating. Everybody participating and making the music and moving and dancing. We are, as we say in OI, we are the singing and dancing species. That's what helps us be together and feel ourselves together. But in this age, things have taken this turn at the domestication in plants and animals turn. The culmination of which is the negativity bias or the what's wrong attention, as we are heightened in our sensitivity to threat. And indeed, the the amplification, the growth of trauma in this context is clear. That is, I am paying attention to what's wrong, and many times the smoke detector of the brain, the amygdala, is overactive, and it is sending these signals internally also that there is something wrong, and then I'm looking for what's wrong. And if I can't find what's wrong, then I really have a problem because I can't find what's wrong, even though I feel that something is wrong. And then there is the way in which we are also, then, there is so much acting out of trauma. And so trauma is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. You know, we used to think that trauma was a relatively, how would we say, a minority affair. That is, you know, it was the domain of war veterans. So if you say post-traumatic stress disorder, if you say trauma, most people think of war trauma. But in fact, there is a very important study that was done, and if you haven't heard of it, this will be also in your list of citations. There's what's called the ACEs studies. The ACE study is adverse childhood experiences, and it really revealed what those of us who've been teaching in the trauma field have known for a long, long time. And that is that trauma is much more widespread. So this study looked at, I think, something like 17,000 people that were in the Kaiser system and asked them questions about trauma as a child, about what they had as trauma as a child. And the results were astounding to the researchers. Again, not so much to those of us who've been working in trauma. You know, when I'm working in a group, then I am seeing the effect, and this is among professionals. I'm seeing the effect of trauma everywhere. So in this study, about 2/3 of those people who were responding, those 2/3 of the 17,000 people, said that they had had one or more traumatic events as a child. This had further shown to have really negative effects on their longevity, like how long they live, on their health, and on their feeling of psychological well-being, their resilience. Now, and keep in mind that these are just questions that are asking people to admit to having had trauma. 2/3 of those folks said yes. You know, there are a lot of people are, one, going to not remember, they're going to have amnesia, or simply not endorse or not say yes to those questions. So we would presume that the actual number is much higher, and that certainly bears out our my clinical experience as well and the teaching experience. So trauma is an epidemic, and it's an epidemic that began with the whole nature of our system disorganization by not being in our ancestral environment, by being overcrowded, right? If you look at studies about crowding, you know, rats that are crowded together in spaces become more hostile and aggressive. Aggression is called a density-dependent factor. So if you group people or other critters in tight spaces, the aggression increases, and that's problematic, of course. So we have now an epidemic of high dysregulation, disorganization, and the what's wrong attention compounds that because my system and our systems are disproportionately influenced by bathing ourselves in negative affect, negative emotion, negative images. You know, the clients will come to me and the negative feeling states are just like they're addictive. And they're addictive because of what a very simple conditioning paradigm called negative reinforcement. And negative reinforcement is a key notion that I'm trying to really call our therapeutic community to understand. Negative reinforcement means that the intensity of the experience then is too much. And when it's too much, when it's intense or averse in some way, then it really then is reinforcing. It's self-reinforcing. That intensity comes up, and at some point it goes down. And then the system often will not stay in a heightened, unpleasant state forever. People find ways of feeling better eventually, and then that feeling better from the height of feeling worse, that reinforces, one, whatever they did to feel better, say drugs, alcohol, or addictive behaviors, or simply by feeling better after feeling worse first, reinforces that paradigm that says the way to feel better is by feeling worse first. And virtually all of therapy is involved in that kind of negative reinforcement. And that includes trauma therapy, because we work in trauma, and the therapist and the client expect that we're going to work on the trauma. And as the person begins to describe their trauma, states of discomfort arise. Eventually those heightened arousal states come down, and the person feels better after feeling worse first. And the negative reinforcement sets in. So, organic intelligence, I've developed a very well thought out protocol for developing and shifting our human biological predisposition from the what's wrong attention and negative reinforcement into a mindfulness frame that looks not for what's wrong but what is, call it coming back to our senses, and in a uniquely positive reinforcement framework. So this takes quite a bit of time. The shift from negative reinforcement to the comfort with positive reinforcement takes quite some time. I'll go into that in our future podcasts in more detail, and you can train in that process also in our human empowerment and resiliency trainings that we have really around the world. So check on that, and let's look a little bit more at the nature of this biology, because this trauma biology is thus addiction biology, because we become addicted to feeling better by feeling worse first. But this negative reinforcement, the negativity bias, there are signs that this is not really natural. It's not really the way things are supposed to work. Listen to this. Babies, there's what's called the Goldilocks Effect. And babies have been studied, and their attention has been studied. And that study includes that babies will seek out just the right amount of complexity. If it's too complex, they'll move away from it. If it's too simple, too uninteresting, they'll move away from it. So it's not too much intensity, not too much complexity, not too little intensity, not too little complexity, but just right. There is the notion of what we call the just noticeable difference. This is a notion in science, is related to an equation called Weber's constant. But it says that there is a specific threshold where we can perceive things. So, for instance, a candle flame can be seen at 30 miles on a dark, clear night. Or for sound, the threshold where you can just hear that is about the tick of a watch under quiet conditions at 20 feet. Taste is where you can just begin to taste something. 1 teaspoon of sugar in 2 gallons of water. Smell 1 drop of perfume in say, a 3-room apartment. Or touch, this is so nice, the wing of a bee falling on your cheek from the distance of 1 centimeter. Right? There are specific and regular thresholds for our biology. Right? A nerve cell begins at a resting potential, say, of minus 55 millivolts. And in its firing, it'll fire and it'll go up to, say, positive 35 millivolts. That threshold is regular. It's specific. And organic intelligence trains clinicians, others, coaches, to see where that ideal intensity threshold is. Not too much, not too little. Where is the complexity and the intensity just enough so that the system comes up, hits that thermostatic point, and then comes down? Mostly, systems are either overshooting or undershooting. They're doing too much, too little, and they are cycling between those. One of the things that I'll include in your package from this broadcast, from this podcast, is a graph, our threshold graph. And we can, by observing the individual and training to see the biology, to see the physical expression, the emotional expression, the voice tone, the movement tone, the muscle tension patterns, the quality of respiration, the heart rate, the ways that the eyes are moving, the content that the person is speaking to. We can learn to bring all of those together in a picture that tells us how intense and what is the pace of intensification of that person in that moment. And I have figured out what that ideal intensity threshold is so that we can help that system come up to that ideal intensity threshold and go right back down. And in that, we are doing something very different than the negativity bias, which is just going up and going up, going up, and a big down. We are going to find that there is a natural oscillation of these ups and downs that is much more subtle than we have thought. And the establishment, the natural support of the natural return to that rhythmic biology is what is healing. And it establishes a rhythm in the biology that organizes, that helps all the other systems that have been disintegrated come back to reintegration. They reintegrate in this rhythmic process that is biological synchrony. So when I'm inviting you to rethink your psychology, I'm actually inviting you to resync your biology. And so with this work, we have the real notion of some help that is not too much, not too little. And it also says why I've been saying for the past 20 years, trauma means unintegrated resource, because the system doesn't really want to do that negativity bias. It doesn't want to stay overactive. All the time, your system is sending signals that would help it do this natural reintegration work, the movement of arousal, de-arousal, that nice oscillation that comes with a breath that breathes in and out and very naturally synchronizes itself. So really what we're talking about when we're talking about trauma is the dispensing of the notion of trauma itself in treatment. Now, trauma is, as I said, from the ACEs study, it's everywhere. But the focus on trauma is the focus on the negativity. It is an example of the what's wrong attention. So in order to work well for ourselves, for others, we want to begin to let go of that focus on trauma and begin to develop new habits of attention. And in organic intelligence, that's going to mean we're going to look more and more at what resources are coming to us naturally. Our OI practitioners that I've trained around the world are going to offer these as sessions, but you can help yourself a lot with this work. And in fact, the help that we intend is help not just for individuals, but for life on the planet. And so in our next podcast, it's called the Human Empowerment and Resiliency Training, Joy and Justice. Because the resynchrony of our biology is the return of our human nature. And our human nature is caring. Our human nature is connection. The human nature is also social existence together and responsibility to one another and our tribe. The call of this moment, I believe, is for us to be able to feel, not just think or have ideals, but to really feel this family of life. Certainly the family of our Homo sapiens, our tribe of Homo sapiens on the planet, but also this family of life. A lot of us have nice ideas about this and are trying to work toward that. Our aim in organic intelligence is to support people with those ideals, to be able to incorporate that and to find the expression of our human nature in joy, in compassion, in caring, and in that experience have a font of resource for sustainable engagement, so that joy is the fuel for justice also. This is also then the end of trauma. Thanks for joining.